AADC is aromatic L-amino acid decarboxylase deficiency, and AADC it's a life-threatening, disabling brain disease, and it affects the biosynthesis and transport of two critical neurotransmitters in the brain, dopamine and serotonin. And because dopamine is a precursor to catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and autonomic nervous systems are affected as well. So diagnosis is a little tough. If a physician doesn't know anything about the disease, it's going to be almost impossible to get a diagnosis. I believe that a child or many children begin symptoms in early infancy, and as they start to progress and grow and reach their milestones, they're going to go back and forth to probably their pediatrician. So oftentimes their pediatrician will then maybe recommend for them to see a specialist, a neurologist. And the neurologist, if the neurologist has no idea of what this disease is, they're basically going to do, I call it $1 million workup. And that's kind of what we went through in the beginning stages of my daughter when she was born. We had to go through what we called $1 million workup. And that meant that the child had multiple tests. They did everything from blood tests to brain scans to x-rays, MRIs, everything to try to find out what was wrong. And honestly, I could tell you a story about how we wound up getting our diagnosis. So in the beginning, when my daughter was first born, she was born what we thought was an absolute normal birth. So we came home from the hospital, everything seemed fine. And the next day, I actually wound up getting sick. So we went back to the hospital to have myself checked out. And while I was at the hospital, I was really nervous because it was wintertime. We were in the emergency room, and I was afraid that my daughter was going to get sick. So I asked my husband to take a walk with her, and he did. And he went up to the mother-infant unit where he ran into another nurse that actually took care of us the night before. And so she saw him and she was like, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm here because of my wife." And she said, "Oh, you look like such a proud dad." And he agreed, and he kissed her on the forehead, and he said, "You know, every time I kiss her, she feels cold." So the nurse said, "Would you like me to take her temperature?" And he said, "Yeah." So the nurse wound up taking her temperature, and her temperature was so low that Jillian most likely would have passed away that night. And so that story is something that I tell all the time, because back then, that was the beginning of our journey. And Jillian had temperature instability. And unfortunately, that's part of that autonomic nervous system playing into not allowing her temperature to regulate. And thus, as a parent, we would never have known that. I've always thought of fever as a young mom. I didn't know to check for a low temperature. So that was a saving grace in the beginning for Jillian's life. But then we were actually discharged from the hospital with, again, what we thought was a normal child that had to just catch up because they thought maybe she was a little premature. So we went home again thinking everything was fine. And that's when all the symptoms started coming into place. So then we started noticing Jillian was hypotonic. That's like a rag doll appearance. She felt very weak in her limbs. I also noticed she had ptosis of her eyes, and in lay terms, that's droopiness of the eyelids. So she had difficulty opening her eyes. And then she started with the oculogyrate crises. So in the afternoon, right around 3 or 4 o'clock every afternoon, she would hyperextend, her eyes would roll back into her head, they would dart side to side, she'd have difficulty breathing, her limbs would get contorted, they'd twist, maybe even go into a decorticate or decebrate type posture where they'd flex across her chest and her hands would be fisted, and she'd be extremely uncomfortable and irritable. So these spells would continue, and they would last for hours, and they wouldn't break until she fell asleep. And then as Jillian started to develop, 3-4 months of age, the symptoms just got worse and worse. And I would go to my pediatrician, and he didn't know what it was, so then he set me up with a specialist. And that specialist was months out. So they never get you an appointment the next day unless you go to the emergency room. So that's basically what I did. My daughter was in one of these ocular gyrate crises. And I decided, I called my husband, and I said I was going to call Children's Hospital. And so I called Children's Hospital to speak with a nurse in the emergency room. And I explained the symptoms. And she basically said, you need to get her to the hospital right now. Call an ambulance and get her here. And so I was surprised. I was like, I can bring her to Children's Hospital. I was unaware because I was already affiliated with another hospital, and I didn't know I was allowed to go to a different physician or a different facility. And so that was my confirmation. And so we packed Jillian up and we brought her to Children's Hospital. And by chance, the doctor that was on call that weekend diagnosed the first case in our country 2 months prior. So we got our diagnosis by chance. Now, today's children, I believe, have a little bit more hope in that awareness is starting to be spread. There are more than maybe 200 cases worldwide now. My daughter was the 4th child in the world diagnosed. So we were very limited with the opportunity to get a diagnostic diagnosis. And now they can actually do a blood test. So if a physician is aware of what to test for, they could do a blood test, and the blood test might be able to be done to recognize the metabolites in the actual blood to determine the disease. Another way is through a spinal tap. So if a child gets a spinal tap, they actually can determine the homovenilic acid levels will be very low. And so they will be able to determine the disease by that way. And another way that they could actually do this is through genetic testing. So if you actually have a child in the womb and you are aware, or you already have a child that's affected, you can have genetic testing done to determine whether or not your next child might have this disease, which my daughter is now 24 years old. We didn't have the opportunities that are coming out today. So now children are being hopeful that they can get gene therapy, and gene therapy is so promising. It's showing so much hope with these children. These kids are going from not able to walk, not able to sit, crawl, talk, to literally sitting, crawling, walking, and talking after gene therapy. And it is promising, and I am so excited for all the children that actually have this opportunity for them today versus what we had 20 years ago.